Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Natural Female Muscle Podcast. Today, for episode number 30, we are going to talk about having a training partner versus training solo. So, the differences between the two. And I think that this is something that I wouldn't say we necessarily have like a never ending debate of it, but you will see different posts or different stories or different people, whether it be in a YouTube video or whatever it may be, talking about maybe the benefits of training solo or the benefits of having a training partner or the disadvantages between the two and which is maybe better for you or which requires more positive and more negative demands for yourself as an athlete. And I think this can sometimes maybe lead to a point where people become like really protective of the way that they train. So they're kind of like very, very stuck in their way of saying, you have to train this way or you have to train that way, which I think we know trickles into a lot of different areas, when it comes to, to bodybuilding. But just in this specific argument or this debate of whether you train with a training partner or whether you train solo. And I think that I wouldn't say it's necessarily damaging, but it can lead to, like so many other things, a lot of athletes thinking whether they're doing the right thing for their progress. Because say you're somebody who does train with someone else and you see somebody post and say, I train on my own and I don't feel like I need other people to push me. I don't think you should need that. If you are, you're over reliant or whatever it may be. And then you might think, oh God, am I not doing this right? Am I, wasting time that I could be progressing? And I think that this is where you're then kind of asking yourself, like, are you disadvantaged for not having a training partner? Or then you can think, oh, but, am I now too reliant for having someone else there? And I think ultimately we have to appreciate that just like anything, there are pros and cons to both, you know. One is not necessarily better than the other, or I think even a better way to put it wouldn't necessarily be like pros and cons. It would be that there are just simply things that you have to consider with both approaches in order for you to get the best out of that situation or the best out of both of those situations. Because I think you don't want to get kind of stuck in that situation where you're not developing in any way whatsoever. And we have to appreciate that with bodybuilding, and also you guys will know, like if you listen to the podcast and the way that I often talk about a lot of things, and I don't want this to get twisted in this episode, is that I'm generally always speaking about things in the context of wanting to make your best possible progress. Like that's kind of the most important thing that we are kind of talking about, because bodybuilding in itself is like this nature of like progressing, of constantly building, constantly doing what you can do to make things better. And of course, within that, there is no one way, but there are ways in which you can look at different things in order for you to get the most out of those situations within your own specific context. And I think that we have to look at that for you to figure out what works best for you, whether it be training with someone else, whether it be training on your own, but also for you to be then adaptable in scenarios that are maybe outside of your usual comfort zone or different circumstances that pop up. So say, for example, you usually do train on your own, but circumstances come where someone who's like a close friend has to train with you, or you're training with a client, or you do train with someone else and now that training partner is sick, or they're doing a different split now and you have to now start training on your own. Like, these are situations where it's good for you to be adaptable and to be able to get the most out of your situation no matter the circumstances. So I will kind of run through these different scenarios and run through what I've kind of been through myself to help provide, examples and context of these things. I think it's always helpful to know how these things have maybe played out for different individuals. Because currently for myself, I tend to mix between the two. I know a lot of people think that I do constantly just train with AJ, which of course we go to the gym at the same time. And we often do some things together, but actually very differently to how we used to train. We don't actually like completely train together as much anymore. And for a number of different reasons, like the main one being that we have different sessions. Like we have different sessions, we have different layouts of the sessions. We don't like actually getting in each other's way. So many different things that kind of have found work a little bit better, because as I'll come through later, the likelihood of you being able to do your whole training split with someone else is very low for you both to get exactly what you need out of your training. But I tend to do a mix. Like, I will sometimes do a full session on my own. Like, for example, my push sessions are generally all by myself. My leg sessions are generally all by myself. Sometimes we train pull together because we're generally pretty aligned on those sessions. But for the most part, like, I do a lot of things on my own. Sometimes I do things with him. Sometimes I will do some things with Meg. But it just depends. Like, I tend to do a bit of a mix depending on what works on the day, what I feel up to. And I feel like now I'm in a place where I can manage both of those situations extremely well, like regardless of what the circumstance is. And that's something that maybe in the past I wouldn't be able to do, whether it be the solo session or the training with someone else. Maybe I wouldn't be extracting everything that I could be doing out of those sessions, or maybe it would come as a surprise to train with someone else, or to then suddenly be training on my own. And there would be some limitations in both of those scenarios that would be affecting my ability to get the most out of that. And I think that the position I'm in now and my ability to get the most out of those comes through going through those different phases in my training. So, like, the first 3 years for me of training, I did train completely by myself. I didn't really know anybody in the bodybuilding industry, so even if I wanted to train with somebody, I couldn't, or I was too shy, because I was really, really shy. I mean, I still would like to say that I'm kind of like that now, but I never wanted to reach out to anyone. I didn't ever want to bother anybody or DM someone and say, hey, do you want to train with them? Because I think no one's going to want to train with me. But I kind of appreciate those years for me, because I was able to really just focus on myself and find my own passion for bodybuilding, which I will obviously run through when I go through what solo training obviously means and the benefits that can provide. And then as I got toward the end of 2019, I started doing the odd sessions with Meg before we actually basically trained together as training partners through most of 2020, really, when we both prepped that year. And then following on from that, I began training with AJ. Meg also began training with Kuba, so it kind of worked out quite well at that point, because previous to that, me and Meg were training together and AJ and Kuba were training together, and then we all kind of swapped a bit. So Meg then started training with Kuba and I started training with AJ. And I think that ultimately both of these time periods have allowed me to gain a lot. So I gained a lot out of the time from my just being completely on my own, but then also gained a whole different perspective when training with those two individuals and having those training partners kind of within my life. And that's helped me massively with both circumstances, because I've taken a lot out of the two scenarios that have cross transferred into both training alone and training with other people. So I think that now, you kind of understand where I've been through my journey, and then up to where I'm at now with how I've approached my training. And I think that as a result, then we can kind of start to run through both of these circumstances and some considerations that I think we can take into these in order for us to approach them in a way that is going to allow us to make them as best as possible, but also how they can help one another. So like I've just mentioned, the way that you approach one can also cross transfer into the way that you can get something out of the other approach to training. So we're going to start to run through these below. So the first one we'll go through is training with others. So having a training partner, or maybe just simply training with someone else. So, this can range. It doesn't have to be having a set training partner who you train with every day. It can simply be having, someone you train with every now and then, or it can even just be jumping in on a few movements with someone across a session. Say you hop in on a couple of things with somebody that in a gym, because you're still with somebody else in that movement. They might ask you to spot them, and things like that. So there's no kind of set boundaries on this, but this is just completely not training by yourself. So first things first with this one, I want to touch upon things for you to consider when training with others, when you're looking at your own benefit. So you're trying to think about what's going to work best for you in this situation. So there's two people that are ultimately going to be involved in this training together combo, maybe more. But the first thing you're thinking about is probably yourself, because you're thinking about your own training, your own performance, your own progress. So of course, the most important thing here really is appreciating that who you train with is important, because this can benefit you or it can detriment you. And I think that there's obviously a balance with this, but I think above anything else, as bodybuilders, we're always going to want to prioritize our own process. And we all know that in a way, bodybuilding is somewhat of a selfish sport, I suppose. And we have to make sure that we're doing what is necessary for us in order for us to make our best progress. And I think when you look at a lot of other kind of individual sports, you rarely kind of would see people doing their own training program for them with another athlete, because they're kind of just focusing on what they need to do for their goals and kind of what works for them. And I'm not saying with this at all that you should be picky. Because let's be honest, you can't really be picky with the people that you train with. I think we all sit here and we say, I'd love to train with, somebody at the top, like Miss Olympia or Mr. Olympia or whatever it may be, or somebody who's really at the top of the game. And we can't all really do that. And it's actually nice to just train with people who are your friends and people that you want to train with, people that you like or whatever it may be. But I do think that you have to be aware of how that person trains and whether that's going to be something that actually just meshes well together. Do they have a similar training approach, in the sense that is their approach to the session going to match well with how you like to train, whether it be volume, whether it be intensity. And that's not to say that you can't train with other people with different methods of training, because I actually think that that's really beneficial. Every now and then, I don't think that if you're having a consistent training partner, like having somebody who trains very differently to you, it's just not going to work. But every now and then, I actually think there's benefit in kind of training with people who have very different training styles, just for you to kind of see what you think. Because a large part of bodybuilding, especially from a coaching perspective, it's experimentation and seeing these different things and maybe seeing something you could be doing better, or actually kind of being able to reaffirm to yourself why you don't do something a specific way. But when you're actually consistently training with someone, having somebody who does have a similar style of training, somebody who has a very similar mindset towards training, and just the way that they kind of approach the session and around the session. Because if you're somebody who likes to just focus on the work, be very quiet while you train, and kind of just crack on or whatever it may be, and you're with somebody who doesn't like to take their sessions quite as intensely, and actually works better for them to be a bit more lighthearted across the session and have a bit of a chat and not overthink things as much. If that's something that doesn't work well with you in terms of the way that you like to train, that's probably not going to end well, because you're likely going to be irritated by somebody maybe talking to you consistently across the session, if that affects the way that you need to be for you to focus in that session. And vice versa for that other person, if they don't like being so intense in the session and you're super intense, it's too much, it's going to put them off from their progress. So having somebody who can actually work well with you during the session, you can both feed well off of each other's approach and each other's energy, is really important. And this is something that will probably change as well through different phases of your process as well. So there's going to be a huge difference from the people that you'll maybe want to train with when you're peak off season versus when you're 12 weeks out, or when you're 4 weeks out, or when you're 2 weeks out. It's unlikely that you're going to want to be training with somebody who is very, very different to you when you're literally 4 weeks out from a show, or you're just in prep and you don't actually have the energy availability to kind of deal with that. So there's a huge kind of sliding scale in when you can do these things. But I think that as an athlete, when you are looking at maximizing your process, you have to be somewhat protective at a point of your own training performance, particularly when you are in a prep scenario, because you have a finite amount of sessions in a prep. I know that we often like to think that preps are very long sometimes, and they might feel like that, but when you actually break them down, you might see that you've only got 20 sessions across a prep, or whatever it actually is, and you're like, oh, right, okay, I need to actually be more protective of this, and I can't just let these sessions go away in sessions that weren't productive, or I wasn't able to take my best work, or whatever it may be. So I think you do, in a sense, have to be somewhat kind of selective with that. And on the flip side of that, with being selective in the way that you actually get to train with people who you really want to train with, and kind of not being afraid to ask as well, because even I was I mean, obviously, but like, I didn't think that Meg would want to train with me when I first trained Ultraflex, and she kind of just came up to me and she was like, like, let's train together. And I was a bit, I was a bit taken back. I was like, oh God, I'm really nervous because, what if I don't train hard enough? And I don't know, like, we weren't really that close at that point. I see this is like 4 years ago now. But actually not being scared to be in those scenarios, and rather than being like, no, 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 it's fine, you train your own, like, I'm not good enough to train with her or whatever it may be, I like actually put myself out there and appreciate, what, I have so much I can learn from this. And being able to train with people like Meg, like AJ, and even, more amazing people that I've had the ability to train with, like incredible athletes, it's something that I have been able to take so much out of. And that's kind of up to you with how much you take away from it, because I see people that will get the opportunity to train with people like AJ or people like Meg or whoever it is that you look up to from a training standpoint, but they're not really taking everything they could be getting out of that session, because there's so many fine details that you can take away from that. And that's not a case of you necessarily like asking them anything, because it also kind of depends on how that person trains. If you know that that person likes to not talk too much while they're training, I probably wouldn't ask them a million and one questions, but you can learn so much through just watching them. And this is where I learned so much of my training from. And prior to even, being able to have people there in person, I was watching in the gyms. A huge part of why I was in that Ultraflex environment was to watch people. If you don't have people in your environment that train like that, even just watching like YouTube videos, watching the content on NBW, Trained by JP was a huge source for that for me at the time, is like watching people train. And through being there in the session, of course, with those individuals, I could see not just, how they approached a set and where their real failure point was. And that was like the first times that I was like actually seeing what failure kind of looked like, but seeing how they approach their sets, before the set, after the set, in between sets, are they getting distracted by other things? Do they have their phone around them? Are they thinking about the work? How are they controlling their breathing? Where is their focus during a set? Where's their like vision focused on? All these different things that helped me to really, really, really see like how I could improve the way that I was approaching my training at that point. Because with a lot of things, like, you can obviously learn so much of this through your own self-development, but when you can actually put yourself in those positions and learn from those people, you can kind of, I wouldn't say shortcut, but you can learn things a lot faster. It's like, rather than you spending so long experimenting yourself, it's like you have the textbook right there and you have the results. So utilize that, absolutely utilize that. If you get the opportunity to train with someone, and you do train with someone who's more experienced than you, like, watch, learn, and take everything that you can away from those individuals, because it can massively, massively help you. It definitely helped me, like I said, to appreciate like my mindset approach, and especially increasing intensity, because I suppose in those first few years, whilst I was training like as hard as I could on my own, I was still in my initial years of training. So I'd never had somebody there. Honestly, I'd never had somebody spot me and push me all the way to failure. And like I said, you can develop this on your own, but when you actually have somebody there to push you and be like, no, you have more in the tank, like, keep going. And you obviously have that safety net, like, you can really, really push yourself. And that helped me to truly understand where my actual failure point was. And I'm not just talking like, oh, me training on my own and failing until I racked the set, because you can sometimes be like training by yourself and you like keep going until you just kind of like fail in the hole, or you fail at the bottom. But sometimes that's not actually true failure. That's just you kind of like getting to a point where you misbrace the set and you can no longer get that rep up, rather than taking one final rep that is really, really slow and really hard. Like, that is failure. Like, failing at the bottom is just like either poor management of the set, or it's just like you misbraced or misgrooved your last rep and you actually missed out on that failure rep most of the time, honestly. So I was able to learn how to actually do that through having somebody there to show me what that looked like, to see them do that, and for me to actually then implement that kind of like by myself as well. So that was something, these are a lot of the things that obviously then, really helped me to level up my own training with being in those sessions with them. I also learned how to, spot other people and things like that, which was definitely something, I mean, we even still argue about sometimes, but that I was not very good at doing when I first started training with AJ, was actually spotting him. And that's obviously helped me as a coach to level up as well, because at the time I had just kind of started coaching, and, being able to then learn how to really look at somebody else's training and help them with that as well, was really, really helpful for me to develop in that aspect too. So these are a lot of things that we're looking at. First and foremost, how does this benefit you? But there's more things to keep in mind when training with others than just the things that benefit yourself. And like I said at the start, training with others, 2 people or more are involved. So it's not just about you. As much as that person affects your training also affects them. You're taking your energy into their sessions. You're taking your approach, your mindset, your mood into their sessions as well. So you have to be really damn mindful of where your headspace is at that day, what energy you are bringing to the session and what you're doing, because that was probably one of the biggest things that I wasn't good at back in like 2020, was especially because it was my first prep, and honestly, even coming out of that off season, was if I had a bad session, if I had a bad day, if my mindset wasn't in a good spot, I didn't have the ability to control it in the way that I do now. And that would really impact that person's session. It really would. And you have to be mindful of that when you're training with someone else. Like you do, because it's not fair to them. Like, can you imagine if somebody else was feeding that into your session? Like, that's not good, and if you're constantly like, like failing sets and throwing your toys out the pram and spitting your dummy out and just like getting aggravated, like you can't be doing that when you're training with somebody else consistently. Like that's just going to really, really negative affect them. So you have to seriously check that with yourself when you're training with somebody else. And it doesn't really matter if like you're tired or you're having a bad day, you kind of need to be there for them. Like there's definitely an aspect of like give and take with training. Like, for example, sometimes you'll have a bad day, sometimes they'll have a bad day, or maybe you'll be in prep and they're in off season, or the other way around. And sometimes you have to push each other a little bit more or be there to feed him some more like positive energy. But for the most part, you can't just be the one who's just draining or the one who's just constantly giving or whatever it may be. You need to consider always kind of trying to give your best in whatever that looks like on that day. It's also not that individual's ability responsibility, to push you. Like their role in that session, and unless they're like your PT, their job is not there to make sure that you have an amazing session at the same time. Like they're not there to basically push you constantly if you are down, or to really make sure that you're constantly training like really hard if you're just not giving yourself that accountability in the session. And you can't be lazy with your own intent, because you do become reliable on someone. So that's the one thing you do have to take into consideration, is like, I'm not saying that you can come over reliant on a training partner, but make sure that you aren't like just kind of giving in a little bit on where your failure point is, because you know that they'll spot you, or you're not actually turning your headspace on because you're expecting them to kind of encourage you throughout the set. Like you still have to channel your own energy and your own focus in your own session, even if somebody else is kind of there, because like I said, it is not their responsibility to do that. You also can't try and do exactly what your training partner's doing. This is this is probably a huge thing, and this comes under a few different like scenarios really. I think that the first one is simply like training a setup, so like the actual sessions. There's probably going to be a few things that you can't do together. I know that you might think, oh yeah, let's do the same setup, let's train the same split, everything, but it's unlikely that that's going to be the case. You're probably not going to be able to do everything together. Your volume might not need to be the same. They might be doing an extra set or adding an intensifier onto a set, but you might not have the recovery capacity to actually like recover from that and to actually gain benefit from that work. And that was a huge thing that I had to understand with training with AJ, was that we have different physique demands. We also have different training aspects that we need to improve, and we have massively different recovery capacities. And what maybe he might be able to recover from, I couldn't recover from. And even likewise, you know, some things that I could recover from, he couldn't. So it's like you have to really, really pay attention to still what's important to you in that situation rather than just trying to do what they're doing. You also really have to be careful with, especially if you're training with somebody who's mainly maybe like quite kind of close to you in terms of strength. Like, this is the benefit of me training with AJ, is he's so far off from me in terms of strength. Like, he's so much stronger than I am, that there's never like competition for me to try and keep up with him. And a little bit of competition is like fun and it does push you, and I think it is good, but you can't let this really pull away from like your quality of the work or what you need to be taking away from it, because you do see it all the time where like you train with someone and then they're putting like a few pins higher than you on like a leg extension. You think, oh, I'm going to do the same, but you're just not strong enough to do that, or that's not where your strengths lie, and that's like totally fine. And I used to probably feel bad about myself if I was like maybe weaker than somebody when I train, but it really isn't something that bothers me at all anymore, because I know that I'm performing to my best ability. You're maybe training with somebody who's very different to you. You know, they have different strengths, different weaknesses. Some people are just mechanically stronger at different movements. Some people are maybe heavier than you, bigger than you, smaller than you. You know, like there's so many different variables that are going to affect this. So like comparison there is like kind of pointless on a lot of things. And I probably, like, even when I used to, honestly, when I used to train with Meg, I'd be like wanting to try and keep up with her, which is great because like it kind of, it, in a way, pushed me to try and like be really strong, which was fantastic. But of course, Meg is going to be stronger than me because she is way more experienced at training than me. She's also in a very different bodybuilding circumstance. So my ability to keep up, especially in a prep scenario, is just not going to be the same. And that's fine. And I needed to really accept that for me to still, you know, take whatever my best quality work was out of those sessions. So, and I think that when you are looking at loads, movement selection, session layout, if you are training with somebody else, it's unlikely you're going to be able to do everything the same. It's unlikely the whole session is going to be the same. It's unlikely you're going to do the exact same thing as them. Like, yes, enjoy things that you can do, but also keep yourself accountable with the things that are maybe actually disadvantaging you from that specific setup. Because you can't just keep ignoring those things that are going to be playing a detriment in your process. So that's really like my overall thoughts when it comes to training with somebody else in that scenario. So comparatively now we can come on to what it's like then to train by yourself. So first and foremost, the considerations and benefits of this. As I mentioned at the start, I do feel as though this is such a valuable part of your training journey and training for you to simply discover your own passion with training and really learn a lot about yourself so that you can actually spend time where you're not thinking about, okay, how can I be doing this better, or what can I learn from someone else, or whatever it may be. And this is like honestly just a almost like a bit of a gateway to bodybuilding as well, is just training and kind of just focusing on that before you kind of worry so much about bodybuilding and making everything perfect. And like for me specifically, like I really enjoyed training by myself, getting into training because it was just my time. Like it was my time where I wasn't reliant on anybody else. It was for my own just overall like process with not even bodybuilding, but just my life. Like it was a huge part of mentally and physically keeping me in a happy place, which was really important. And I didn't have to worry about anything else or like anyone else at that point. And that was a really important foundation for me. And I think that for a lot of bodybuilders, like training on your own at points can be helpful. It massively depends on the person, but it can be helpful for you to kind of come down to just like why you do this and, you know, your enjoyment of this and all of those things. So it did help me to kind of set my baseline of just enjoying bodybuilding without, I'd say, I mean, I say constantly putting pressure on myself in a sense, where, you know, ultimately, as I said, I was quite shy and I didn't really want to reach out with anyone else. I didn't want to feel pressured to train with other people or to prove anything. I just wanted to focus on me, and that really, really did help. Now, of course, one of the huge benefits of training on your own, kind of leading on from that, is like, let's be real, you don't have to think about others. Like, you don't have to worry about other people. You can manage your time as you want to. You can rest as long as you want. You can train as long as you want. You can train when you want. You can train how you want. All of these things, you just don't have to worry about other people, which can be a huge stress release in a lot of circumstances, particularly if you do maybe find that if you were to train with someone else, it would affect your routine and it would really kind of throw off your day and it's taking too long and all of these things. So, you can just simply focus on your performance and really pay attention to yourself. And you can kind of just literally take your performance where it needs to go on your own, because one thing that I do think is that if you have somebody there who is, like I've already said, like someone who negatively affects your session. So we've already touched upon, you affecting their session, but of course somebody can affect your session. Having somebody who negatively affects your session and like somebody who doesn't aid your performance, like I do think that like a bad spot is worse than not having a spot at all, because it's really frustrating if you do go into a session and you have somebody there and they're taking loads of reps away from you, or they're maybe not helping you when you need it, and you just feel like, honestly, I'd rather just train on my own. And that's not a bad thing. Like if you want to just have your own space, like don't be afraid to just own that and take that and go, you know what, like I'm just happy. I'm happy doing this. And I've tried and tested being with other people, and it just annoys me more than anything else. Like, and that's okay. That's really okay. But on that note though, if you do actually train on your own and you do need people to help you in the gym with a spot or whatever it may be, don't be afraid to ask, because I used to be really scared to ask, and in a way, like I probably could have benefited from it in a little bit, because like I've said, having someone to push you can help. And if you know there's somebody in your gym who knows how to spot and knows how to train, like, and they're not maybe about to do a top set or something, don't be scared to ask, because especially if you are in a gym environment where people are supportive, they probably will want to come and help. But as I just said, having somebody there who maybe isn't helpful as a spot, you'd probably rather just train on your own. So that's a huge benefit there. So, I mean, those are kind of the main benefits, because it is a really important benefit of training on your own, is like you get to focus on yourself, you get to have your own headspace, you get to manage your session how you want, which is massive. Like that's a huge part of your overall experience. So there's obviously so many other things that will be specific to yourself when it comes to why you enjoy training on your own. But those are kind of the main things I would say. And like for me, definitely that's the biggest thing, is just like having my own place. I can come away from work, I can focus on myself, I can really be an athlete, I can take the session at the pace that I want to, I can do all these things that kind of help me to enjoy that couple of hours that I have across the day. But I will say that there are a few issues that often lie within this. And this comes down to like two main things, which is one, the intensity of your sessions and how that can fluctuate. And two, the ceiling on self-development when you are only ever training by yourself, or predominantly only ever training on your own. And this is completely reliant on the individual, like the amount of time that you've been training for and your own experience with development and the issues that you are encountering. Because I know plenty of people and I have plenty of clients who have only ever trained on their own and their training is phenomenal. Like they've gained so much out of just simply like their own development or the coaching process, and really being able to like take on board the things that we go through on a weekly basis and implement that. And their training on their own has been incredible. But then there's also people, and I'll put myself into this camp, where like I really have benefited from having somebody there to like further my development more, and to like actually just kind of like almost like prod me with a stick and be like, Loz, sort this out. Because it is easy when you are training on your own to kind of let things slide, like let form slide, let your headspace slide, all of these things. Like I can definitely train solo now very differently to how it was 5 years ago. And I think that the biggest thing is like all of these things that I've learned, like, yes, I could maybe have learned them through still continuing to train myself, but it would have taken me personally a lot longer to do that. And there's been a lot of things that I have benefited from having, somebody actually there. So the problem for me at that point, like 3 years in, just training on my own, was I hadn't been surrounded by enough people or enough influence to really push me to train better, both physically and mentally. Like a lot of the time, like maybe I would be stopping shy of failure, or my quality of sets would get worse because I'm trying to then reach a number and nobody's there to tell me like that rep was shallow, or you rushed that eccentric, or you just completely like mentally came out of the set, or whatever it may be, or you hit fake failure. Like that's a huge one, and Meg used to call me out on that a lot at the start, where she was like, you just completely hit fake failure there, where like quite simply you kind of pretend to fail, like you make the rep slower, or you like make like, I know it sounds silly, but you kind of like almost like make facials, or you make noise. Like I used to be so loud when I trained. Like you'll probably watch my training now and I rarely ever make any noise, because I'm focused on channeling all of my energy into my sets. Whereas I used to be like, I could make a loud noise on the last rep to make it look like I failed. It's like, that's not failure. That's just fake failure. You're just trying to basically dramatize something to look like it's there. And you'll do that when you're on your own, because, or when you're with someone else, because you're trying to like validate that you failed when really you haven't. And like I needed somebody to call me out on that, to be like, no, like that was crap. Like you need to fix that. You need to learn from that. So like having that like feedback or having those cues like massively helped. And I did learn that a lot, and it was a lot more effective for me through basically asking people, or like having the feedback in the moment and somebody like telling me and calling me out on it. Because like you can definitely learn this from a coach, and of course it makes a huge difference for me that like I train with my coach, but actually having that feedback and putting it in place, and you can do this with your coach anyway if they respond to your like form clips and things like that too. But even having a training partner who says like, I know your coach has said that you've not done this, like I'm going to keep an eye on you and make sure that you don't do that, because that's actually also really helpful. And I've done that sometimes when like maybe I have trained with Meg and I said like, look, AJ's paid attention to this and I need to make sure that I control my eccentrics, or I take a pause, can you make sure I do this? And your training partner can then keep you accountable with those things, which is really helpful. So having somebody to put you in your place with that physically, with the way you approach things, great. The way that you get somebody to also then call you out on the way that you're approaching things from a mindset perspective is huge, because mindset in all sports is massive. Mindset in training is absolutely like so significant in the outcomes you can take from a session. And as I've noted upon, the way that you mentally approach a session affects others. And this was something that hit me really hard, was that when I always trained on my own, I often had like quite an, I wouldn't say negative headspace, but I was very, very prone to kind of like giving myself shit, or beating myself up, or like literally spitting my dummy out, or getting angry and doing all this stuff that was honestly like pointless. And now I look back and it's like, it's wasted energy. And you'll see through a lot of like my Instagram posts, I've talked about this a lot. But when you're on your own, you're the only person that like hears that in your head. You're the only person that sees your actions and the way your body language changes and the way that your face changes with, looking upset or looking annoyed. Whereas when you're with someone else, like they see that, and then that also affects them. So having somebody who's not afraid to basically call you out on your BS there is like massive. I needed someone to do that, because otherwise I would have just continued and continued and continued to just act like that in my sessions. And it played a huge role when I trained with Meg. So when I trained with Meg, I mentioned this before, in 2020, as we got towards the end of that set, like my headspace was just terrible when it came to training. Like I was putting pressure on myself. I was getting annoyed at sessions. I was just like not like prioritizing just enjoying my sessions, having a good time. If I had a bad set, like I wasn't, just going, oh, you know what, I'll move on, I'll make the rest of the session good. I was letting it feed into everything else. And if I had a bad day, it was feeding into my session. If I was tired, it was feeding into my session, all these things. And Meg like had a serious word with me, and she was like, Loz, I can't deal with this. You need to sort this out. And I needed to hear that. It was really, really important for me to hear that. And it massively then improved my training for the rest of the prep, which I then trained by myself. I massively improved even my approach to my own training from there. And I've even had, I mean, not really anymore, but in the first, well, not all anymore, but in the first, I would say 3-4 months of my off season. So like the end of 2020, I started training with AJ, and when I then started to creep back into off season, my negative headspace started again, because I was no longer in like a pressure cooker of like, okay, I need to train well for my prep. It was like, I need to train really well because I need to, make this amazing progress and this and that. And so I was in a spot where if I was failing a set, or if I was not taking a progression that I wanted to, or I'd had a bad day. It was massively affecting my session, and I was getting really upset and really annoyed with myself, and it would affect the rest of my work. And even to the point where, like, if I, like, say I felt good, because it's not necessarily just about having bad work. It's like, say you go into a session and you feel really good and you're like, I'm going to take a strong set today. And then you go in and you just get in your head and you bottle the set. And then you get more annoyed at yourself, like all of these things. I didn't have them under control. And a lot of athletes perform like this, but they don't have somebody who tells them to just stop doing that. And I'm very like, I'm very honest with this. If I have clients that do really get in the head and they're mentally limiting themselves, I'll be very honest and say, like, you need to fix this, and this is how we can fix this. Because you need to, like, know when you're doing something that's massively affecting you, and you need to know, like, okay, if you want to be a really good athlete and you want to make this better, this needs to be better. And I benefited from having AJ being honest with me. Like, he would not be like, oh, it's okay, like, you've had a bad day. He would be like, no, you're literally being dramatic. You've affected my session. You've affected your session. You need to make this better. You need to fix your head, because it's also like, what are you bodybuilding for if you're literally just like being in a bad, not like in a bad mood, but you're like beating yourself about training all the time. You're like creating a bad headspace. You're telling yourself you're not strong. You're doing this and that. Like, not only is it affecting you in the session, but it's just affecting like the longevity of training, because you don't believe in yourself. You don't think you're strong. You're not focused on just like taking your best outcomes and like trying to be positive, like sort it out, And I needed that. I needed that at that point in my training career. Like, I'd still only been training for like 3-4 years at that point. So I still had a lot of development to kind of take on board. And that massively helped me. And that's where, like, when you do train by yourself, I think having somebody else to help you, with that ceiling of self-development is massive. And that can be, there's two things: it can be a training partner, but it can also be a coach. Like, your coach can really help you a lot with those things. But you obviously have to be accountable with your training and be honest about how you're handling your training in order to get those things, which a lot of people don't. Like, I used to, when I was coached by Cuba, just be like, yeah, training's good, training's good. Whereas then when I actually trained with AJ, he was seeing my training. Or even when I started training with Meg was seeing my training and telling Cuba and being like, shoot, she's not okay. So actually kind of like having people there to keep you accountable with that is really, really massive. And I was able to come away from these situations and really transfer it to my own training, and working on all of those above variables to find my own recipe for how I needed to approach my training, because that's obviously my own example of how it affected me, but it's not the same for everyone. So everyone's going to have their own different experience, their own issues that affect them in their sessions, whether it be getting nervous for sets, or whether it might be other stresses, or whatever it is. And you can figure out what those things are going to be that will help you to improve those issues, so that when you do train with others, or you do train on your own, you can improve that. And I think the benefit of all of this for me is that it's allowed me to find a way that I can now have incredible sessions on my own that I know I'm extracting the most out of. Like, and I can say 100% that I wouldn't be where I am now with training without having all of those different experiences, because, as I've already said, it would have probably taken me an additional 5 or 10 years through training on my own to get to where I am now. So if I was continually just too scared to put myself in those scenarios, I never would have learned the way that I have done. So I'm glad that I have put myself there in situations where, I was experiencing like brutal honesty, and I was challenging myself with something that I probably wasn't even ready for, but something that forced me to adapt, something that forced me to develop, and to be better. So like, I think you have to appreciate, and I see this as like, training solo is epic. Like, honestly, this is generally my favorite place to be. Is just like training on my own and having a spot when I need it. But don't be just training on your own for fear of like not wanting to go out of your comfort zone, for fear of not wanting to see what you could be doing better, or just simply wanting to stick to the way that you do things and not learn anymore, or not see what you could be doing better. Because, as I already said, you might even figure out, okay, I'm actually doing things fine, but that's like, at least that just gives you the affirmation. But don't be afraid of like being in that scenario where you can learn from somebody else, in a multitude of different ways, so ultimately I think that when we look at this, like training with others versus training on your own, both are absolutely fantastic. They really are. And everyone's going to have their own preference of what they genuinely prefer. But I think that both situations provide different benefits. Like in terms of developing your approach to training, you can get something out of all of these different scenarios. And I think when you are somebody, as I said, who wants to continually develop their approach and the way that they view something or what they can get out of something, which training especially is the most important thing, really, you need to utilize the two different approaches for you to develop on your own, so develop independently, whilst also gaining external perspective that allows you to be better. That's the way that I really see things. I think only ever using one or the other can be a detriment, and somewhat limiting to you becoming overly reliant on one or the other. I think having a mixture of the two at different points, like it could be solo training with a sprinkling of a few sessions with others every now and then, or it could be training with a partner with a sprinkling of sessions on your own every now and then. It can be whatever it like has to be. But I do think that utilizing a mixture of these different things can be extremely helpful. And no matter what, having perspective with both and prioritizing your abilities constantly be better is the most important thing. So hopefully that's been a little bit of a helpful one for you guys to listen to today, just to kind of hear my thoughts on both of them. And it's always so hard when we talk about, honestly, any of these topics relating to the way we manage our bodybuilding process, because there's no blueprint that we can really go through, because when we're thinking about bodybuilding, we're working with individuals. When we're working with individuals, there's a multitude of different circumstances and factors that affect what makes that person tick. And that's why coaching is so important, because with coaching, you learn to learn an individual. And when you learn an individual, you can then coach that individual well. It's not about this training program or this approach to this or this mindset approach to this. It's like, I know what your stress response is. I know what your life is like. I know the way you think about different things. I know how you physically can approach something, all of these different things that then allow for your coach and the individual themselves to figure out what works best for them. So, I don't want anyone to take what I've said, especially with my own example, as like, oh, okay, this is what Loz has done, so maybe I need to do that as well. Like, please, no, don't do that. Do what works for you. But I wanted to give my example to show how, in my situation, how I've used both of them. And the way that you maybe want to utilize both of them will be different for you. And it's ultimately just about you getting what you need out of that. But yeah, hopefully this has been a good one, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this episode as always. If you can, like, subscribe, follow, and rate, ideally with 5 stars on Spotify, that would be amazing. It does really help, and it helps to know that you're enjoying the episodes. And like, thank you so much to anyone who does share the episodes and tags me and like says if they've enjoyed it or they found it helpful, because that's honestly like amazing for me to actually see, because I want to make sure that like people are enjoying these, they are able to get something out of them. And it's really nice to hear that the last episode was received so well with the this sort of like imposter syndrome episode that I went through. So yeah, if you have enjoyed it, like, let me know, pop me a message. And if you want to ask me anything about like yourself in this circumstance, or even anything more about like how I've managed different things, like, pop me a message. I'm always happy to talk to anyone about anything that I can possibly help with at all. Yeah, thank you so much for listening, guys, and I'll be back again next week with another episode.